If you're over 55, this explains why everything feels different now. Carl Jung observed that the human soul does not run on one program for 80 years, it runs on at least two. And somewhere past the middle of life, the first one simply stops working. Here is where we begin. In his essay on the stages of life, Jung wrote, "We cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, for what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie." From Volume 8 of his collected works, paragraph 784. And he would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? You did not fail at 55, you simply kept reading from a script written for someone half your age, the ambition that once got you out of bed. The need to prove something, the hunger to be chosen, none of it was false when you were 30, but it was never built to last a lifetime. It was built to get you through the morning. And if everything around you feels quietly different now, thinner in places, heavier in others, that is not your mind failing you. That is your mind finally telling you the truth about the hour. I want to sit with you for a moment, before we go further, because I think something in you has been afraid to say this out loud. You built a life, you did the things you were supposed to do, and now you look up and wonder why the applause does not land the way it used to, why the achievement feels like dust in your hand. You are not broken, and you are not alone in this room. So let us name it plainly, and then let us do something with it. Say it with me. I stop measuring my life by a clock that has already run out. I let the truths of my morning rest, so the truths of my evening can speak. I make the unconscious conscious. Again, I stop measuring my life by a clock that has already run out. I let the truths of my morning rest, so the truths of my evening can speak. I make the unconscious conscious. If this kind of teaching is useful to you, consider subscribing quietly, so tomorrow's reflection finds its way to you as well. And before we go further, if something in what I just said landed somewhere true, type the words "face it" in the comments. Just those two words. Let it be a small seal on what you already know underneath. The first key is this. What feels like decline is often the closing of a program, not the closing of you. Jung called the first half of life the morning, and the tasks of the morning are clear. Establish yourself, find a place in the world, build a family, or a career, or a name. Gather the tools of survival. And this morning program is not shallow. It is necessary. Without it, none of us would ever leave home, or earn a living, or raise a child. But a program built for establishing a life is not built for questioning what that life was for. And past 55, the questions start arriving whether you invited them or not. You sit in a familiar room and feel a stranger's quiet. You finish an old ambition and feel less than you expected. Imagine a man who spent 30 years rising before dawn to check the schedule, the orders, the calls that needed returning. And one ordinary Tuesday, he wakes at the same hour, out of habit. And there is nothing waiting that needs him the way it once did. He makes the coffee anyway. He sits at the same table, and a kind of static fills the space where urgency used to live. He assumes something is wrong with him, when in fact the only thing that has happened is that a program built for gathering has run out of things to gather. This is not sadness without a cause. It is the unconscious retiring a script that has served its purpose. Think of it the way a farmer thinks of the seasons. No one calls a field a failure because it stops yielding the crop of spring once autumn arrives. The field has not broken, the season has simply turned, and a mind that keeps demanding morning weather from an afternoon sky will always feel something is going wrong, when nothing is going wrong except the hour itself. Jung would tell you plainly, you are not falling apart, you are simply out of morning material. One small correction here, because the culture likes tidy timelines. The idea that life begins at 40 came from a writer named Walter Pitkin, not from Jung, and the phrase midlife crisis was coined later still by a researcher named Elliot Jaques. Jung's own vision was slower and less dramatic than a crisis with a headline. He saw a season change, not an explosion. So if nothing has exploded and you still feel the ground shifting, trust that. The ground really is shifting, not because you have lost your footing, but because the floor itself was only ever meant to hold you for one part of the walk. The first door closes. I let the morning end without shame. The second key is this: the parts of yourself you set aside to build your life do not disappear, they wait. And past a certain age they begin to knock. Jung noticed that the unlived life does not simply vanish when we choose one path over another. It goes into the unconscious, and it stays there, gathering weight, and somewhere in the second half of life, it starts asking to be let back in. Think about what you set down along the way. Maybe it was a talent you were told was impractical. Maybe it was a softness you buried under competence. Maybe it was curiosity you traded for stability. Maybe it was simply time alone with your own thoughts that you never allowed yourself because there was always something more urgent. None of it died. It has been sitting in a room you stopped visiting. And now, with the morning program running out of fuel, that old room is the only one with any light left in it. Imagine a woman who played piano as a girl. Seriously, hours a day. And then life arrived the way it does. A career that paid the bills. A family that needed her attention. A house that needed managing. And somewhere in her 30s, the piano became a piece of furniture. Something to dust. Something the children's homework got stacked on. She did not decide to stop. Exactly, she simply had no hour left to give it. And 30 years passed this way without her noticing the years passing. And then one ordinary evening past 55, alone in the house for once, she lifts the lid and plays something badly, clumsily, her hands stiff, and something in her chest breaks open that has nothing to do with the music being good. This is not sentimentality. Jung would say, this is the unconscious presenting its bill, calling in what was owed. The piano was never really about the piano. It was about a whole way of being alive that got postponed for good reasons and never unpostponed. This is why so many people past 55 find themselves drawn back to something from decades earlier, an instrument, a language, a faith, a friendship they let go, a garden, a notebook of half-finished poems, a version of themselves they quietly abandoned for practical reasons that made complete sense at the time. It is not nostalgia, and it is not weakness. Jung would say, it is the unconscious doing its arithmetic. And here is the part that surprises people. This knocking can feel like loss before it feels like invitation. The ache of it can be mistaken for depression. When it is closer to a summons, you feel the pull toward the old thing and immediately talk yourself out of it. Too late now. What would be the point? And that voice, reasonable as it sounds, is the very voice that postponed the thing 30 years ago in the first place. Still guarding the same door, still insisting the room stay closed. So pause for a moment and pick one real thing you set aside years ago for a good reason at the time. Just name it honestly to yourself, not to fix it today, only to notice it is still there, waiting the way an old room waits. Dust on the furniture, door unlocked the whole time. Nobody outside that room but you ever had the key. I open what I long ago closed. The third key is this: sometimes the whole structure has to come down before the second half of life can be built honestly, and Jung knew this from the inside, not as a theory but as a wound. In the years after his break with Freud, Jung entered what he later called a period of disorientation. He described it in memories, dreams, reflections. In his late 30s, established, respected, and yet he felt, in his own words, suspended in mid-air. And instead of working harder to silence that feeling, he let the not knowing be what it was. He later wrote that this frightening period became the source material for nearly everything of value he did afterward. The descent was not a detour from his life's work, it was the beginning of it. Think of what a structure actually is. A house does not announce a shifted foundation all at once, it shows small signs first. A door that sticks, a crack near a window that was never there before, and the sensible response is not more paint. It is to ask what is happening underneath. Most of us, faced with cracks appearing past 55, reach for the paint instead. We take on a new project, fill the calendar tighter, tell ourselves to simply try harder at being who we have always been, and the crack widens anyway, because paint was never going to answer a question about the foundation. Imagine a woman who spent decades as the one everyone relied on, and past 55 she notices a flatness creeping into ordinary tasks. So she fills it the way she always has, another committee, 3 afternoons a week with the grandchildren instead of 1, and it works for a while, until one evening she is folding laundry that is not even hers and finds herself crying without quite knowing why. This is not a symptom to manage away, it is the structure itself asking to be examined rather than reinforced. The busyness was never the problem. It was a morning tool applied once more to an afternoon question it was never built to answer. Walk through what this can look like across an ordinary week. Tuesday brings the same motions as always, and somewhere around mid-morning, a strange flatness settles in. Not sadness exactly, more like static. Wednesday, a memory surfaces uninvited. A room, a version of your own face you have not seen in years. Maybe you sit on the garage floor with an old photograph longer than you meant to. Thursday, you are irritated at something small and cannot say why. Friday, you are simply tired in a way sleep does not fix. This is not the week of someone falling apart. This is the week of an old structure quietly loosening its grip, so its foundations can finally be examined honestly. And this matters. The flatness and the unexpected tears are not malfunctions to fix by the weekend. They are the sound of a program shutting down, so a truer one can be heard underneath it. The woman crying over borrowed laundry is not further from wholeness than she was the week before. She is closer, because the crack has finally been allowed to show itself instead of being painted over one more time. Try this practice this week. Call it the morning program audit. One evening. List the rules you have lived by since you were young. Work hard, do not complain, be useful, keep the peace, and beside each one ask honestly, is this still true for me now? Or was it only ever true for the morning? Do not rush to replace what no longer answers. Let the empty space stay empty a while. That emptiness is not a hole in your life. It is room being cleared for what comes next. I stop measuring my life by morning's ruler. The fourth key is this. The values that governed your first half were never wrong. They were simply seasonal, and the evening is allowed to have a different truth than the morning did. This is the heart of what Jung meant when he wrote that what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. Notice, he did not say the morning's truth was a lie all along. He said it becomes a lie if you keep carrying it past its hour. In your morning, usefulness may have been the highest value, providing, achieving, being needed, and that value earned its keep. It built the house you live in. But in the afternoon of life, a different question starts to matter more. Not, what am I producing? But what am I for? Not who needs me, but who am I apart from being needed? Let me walk you through what this looks like in an ordinary week. Because it rarely announces itself with drama. Imagine a man who spent 40 years answering the phone the moment it rang, because answering meant he was needed, and being needed meant he mattered. One Tuesday afternoon the phone rings, and he lets it go to voicemail, not out of exhaustion, but because some quiet part of him simply did not reach for it the way it used to. He sits there afterward feeling strangely guilty, as if he has betrayed something. But he has not betrayed anything. He has simply outgrown the rule that said every ring must be answered. By Thursday of that same week, he catches himself enjoying an hour with no purpose attached to it at all. No task finished, no one served, and instead of the old restlessness, there is something closer to peace. This is not laziness arriving late in life, this is the evening's truth quietly introducing itself. Jung said the change has, in his words, a significance of its own, meaning it is not a falling away from meaning, but a movement toward a different kind of meaning, one that has less to do with output and more to do with depth. The morning asks, how much did you accomplish? The evening asks, how honestly did you live? And these are not the same question dressed differently. They are two separate measuring sticks, and trying to measure an evening life with a morning ruler will always leave you feeling like you are failing at something, when really, You are simply using the wrong instrument. This also touches your closest relationships. A marriage or a long friendship built on one person providing and another receiving can feel suddenly unfamiliar when the providing slows down. The wife who spent decades organizing everyone's life may find her adult children no longer need organizing. The husband who spent decades being the strong one may find his hands are simply tired, and both partners can mistake this for the relationship dying. When it is often the relationship finally being asked to hold two whole people instead of two roles, the old contract is not broken, it is being renegotiated in a language neither of you were taught. I let evening have its own truth. Friend, if this way of thinking is helping you see your own years differently, subscribing costs you nothing and lets tomorrow's teaching find you too. The fifth key is the deepest one, so let us take it slowly, in pieces, the way Jung himself would have insisted we take it. First, consider that Jung gave this whole process a name. He called it individuation, and he defined it plainly as coming to selfhood. From Volume 7, paragraph 266. Notice what that phrase does not say. It does not say achieving more. It does not say becoming impressive. It says coming to selfhood, becoming the particular person you actually are, underneath the roles you have been playing. The word itself comes from the Latin individuum, meaning that which cannot be divided any further. So this is not the addition of some new shining self on top of the old one. It is the slow gathering of a person back into one piece. The achieving part, the tired part, the part that provided, the part that longed for something else, all drawn back into a single undivided person instead of a scattered set of roles. Jung believed this belongs most naturally to the second half of life, because only then does a person usually have enough lived failure and success, both to stop mistaking the persona for the person. Second, consider a story Jung told in his own clinical writing of a man who had spent his whole career building a business, measuring every day by output. Retirement arrived, the achievements stopped, and the man collapsed, not physically but psychically. He had developed nothing in himself apart from the role of the producer, and when the role ended, startlingly little was left standing. Now bring this closer to home. Imagine a man who spent 30 years as a school teacher, the kind everyone in town remembers. Mornings began with a bell and a room full of names he knew by heart. Then retirement comes, quietly, the way it usually does, and the first Monday after, he wakes at the old hour out of habit, showers, dresses, and stands in his own kitchen with nowhere to be. By Wednesday, his wife asks what he would like to do with the afternoon, and he has no answer, not from laziness, but because for 30 years, the answer was always supplied by the role. By Friday, he is irritable at small things, the television too loud, the mail arriving late, and underneath it, if he were honest, is fear. Who am I now that no one calls me teacher? This is the exact collapse Jung was describing. Not a failure of character, but the discovery that a life lived entirely through one role leaves very little furniture in the room once that role is set down, and it arrives quietly. No single terrible morning, only small empty hours accumulating into a question he has never had to ask before. Third, and here is where I want to turn this toward you directly, because it is easy to nod along at someone else's collapse. Ask yourself honestly, if the roles fell away tomorrow, the job title, the parent of grown children, the provider, the reliable one, what would still be standing? Would there be a person there, or only an absence shaped like a person? This is not meant to frighten you. It is the exact question Jung believed the second half of life exists to ask. You did not arrive at 55 or 75 as a failure of the first half. You arrived as a candidate for the only task that was ever going to matter most, becoming, in fact, yourself. And notice this, individuation is less a straight road toward a destination and more a circling, a slow walking around a center you cannot see directly. Each pass brings you closer. Each pass shows you a room you had not noticed before. So if you feel you are covering the same ground again this year that you covered last year, that is not failure to progress. That may simply be the shape the work takes. A spiral is not a broken circle. It is a circle that has learned to descend. Fourth, consider what stands quietly underneath all of this. And Jung did not shy from naming it. The afternoon of life knows something the morning does not. That dusk is coming. This is not meant to frighten you either. Jung believed an honest awareness of mortality is not morbid. It gives the second half a weight and urgency nothing else can. A person who has made peace with the fact of an ending often lives the remaining years with far more presence than one still pretending the morning will last forever. Think of how differently a person reads a letter when they know it is the last one from an old friend. Every line suddenly matters. Some quiet part of you has begun counting differently now. The days do not stretch out endlessly the way they did at 30, and that counting, uncomfortable as it is also what makes the questions you are asking finally honest ones. Think of an ordinary Sunday afternoon, the kind you might once have let slide by unnoticed while planning next week's tasks, and notice how that same afternoon now carries a weight it never had before. The light through the window lasts the same number of minutes it always did, but you are finally the kind of person who watches it fall. Fifth, and this is the turn worth holding on to. Individuation is not a reward for people who have already solved their lives. It is offered precisely to people whose old structures are cracking. The crack is not evidence you did it wrong. The crack is the doorway. Jung spent his own late 30s and early 40s in exactly this kind of unraveling, before any of his major work took shape. The theory came after the disorientation, not instead of it. So if you feel less certain now than you did at 30, less driven, less sure of the old rules, that uncertainty may be the most honest state you have been in for decades. And here is a small comfort. The people who look most settled from the outside are often the ones who have simply stopped asking, while the person who feels unsettled at 60 is often the one still awake enough to be found. Sixth, and this is the quiet promise underneath everything Jung wrote on this subject, the self coming together in you now was never absent. It was simply outvoted for decades by the loud, useful, necessary business of building a life, the teacher retiring, the businessman collapsing, the version of you standing in your own kitchen with no bell to answer to. None of these are endings. They are the noise, finally quieting enough for something older and steadier in you to be heard. And if you listen for it this week, in an ordinary, unremarkable hour, you may notice it was never lost at all, only waiting for the room to go quiet enough to speak. I come toward my own selfhood, not away from it. The sixth key is this, and I want to leave you with it gently. Everything feeling different now is not the sound of your life ending its usefulness. It is the sound of your life finally being asked to become whole, rather than merely successful. Jung believed the goal of this second half was not perfection, not some flawless finished self, but wholeness, a self that has made room for the parts once left outside, the unlived talents, the buried softness, the questions the morning had no time for. And wholeness is a quieter word than perfection. It does not ask you to erase the years of striving or apologize for the ambition that carried you this far. It only asks that the ambitious years and the quiet years finally sit in the same room together, instead of competing for the last chair. Imagine a man in his late 60s, standing in his own kitchen, on an ordinary evening. Nothing has happened that day. No crisis. No diagnosis. Only the late light coming through the window at an angle he somehow never noticed in 30 years of rushing through that same room before dawn. He does not fix anything that evening. He does not resolve his regrets or plan his remaining years. He simply stands there and notices the light. And Jung would say that small noticing is itself the beginning of wholeness. Not a lightning bolt of insight, but a return of attention to what was always present and always missed. There is a grief tucked inside this kind of evening too, quiet and unannounced. Grief for the version of you that had to end so this version could slowly begin. And Jung never asked anyone to skip that grief or rush past it towards some tidy resolution. He drew mandalas in his own private notebooks during his most disoriented years. small circles that gathered the scattered pieces of a life into one shape, and he came to see them as pictures of the self, quietly attempting to make itself whole, piece by piece, without hurry. So let the ambition rest beside the softness. Let the achievements rest beside the failures. Let the person you were rest beside the person only now becoming visible. None of them need to win. They only need to finally share the same room. You are not behind. There is no schedule you have missed. The afternoon has always been exactly on time. I welcome the self that is only now becoming visible. Here is the whole picture. The morning program closes. And that closing is not failure. The unlived life knocks. And that knocking is not decline. The old structure loosens. And that loosening is the beginning rather than the end. The values shift from usefulness to meaning. And that shift has a significance of its own. The deepest task appears, becoming who you actually are, rather than the role you played. And finally, all of this gathers into one single recognition. That everything felt different, because you were never meant to run the morning's program forever. You were only ever meant to graduate from it. Jung did not see the second half of life as a slow decline from some earlier peak. He saw it as the point of the whole journey. The part the first half was quietly preparing you for all along, without your even knowing it. The ambition, the striving, the roles, all of it was scaffolding. And scaffolding is meant to come down once the building can stand on its own. If things feel unfamiliar now, if the old motivations have gone quiet, if you find yourself drawn to things you set aside decades ago, none of this is your mind failing you. It is your mind, at long last, telling you the truth about the hour you are actually living in. I stop measuring my life by a clock that has already run out. I let the truths of my morning rest, so the truths of my evening can speak. I make the unconscious conscious. And if everything feels different now, let it. Because different is not the same as diminished. The afternoon has its own light, quieter than the mornings, but often the only light warm enough to finally see yourself by.